Every trade you make is really a promise that on a set day, the seller hands over the shares and the buyer hands over the cash. In the United States, that day is now T+1, one business day after the trade, a cycle shortened in May 2024. But here's the part almost nobody thinks about. What happens when the promise is broken? When settlement day arrives and the shares simply do not show up, the trade did not vanish. It becomes something with a name, a fail to deliver, and it drops into a piece of hidden machinery that decides how fast that broken promise has to be fixed. Understanding that machinery tells you why trade confirming on your screen and the shares actually being delivered are two completely different events. Start with who is actually on the other side of your trade after you hit buy. It is not the anonymous seller. Through a process called novation, a central counterparty steps into the middle of nearly every U.S. stock trade. That counterparty is the National Securities Clearing Corporation, part of the DTCC. It legally becomes the buyer to every seller and the seller to every buyer. Then it nets everything down, so a firm that bought and sold the same stock all day owes or is owed just one net figure. This is continuous net settlement, and this is why single fail does not blow up your trade. When a seller fails to deliver, the clearinghouse still makes the buyer whole. The buyer gets their position. The fail does not disappear, though. It sits inside the system as an open obligation, waiting to be closed. The question the whole system has to answer is, how long is it allowed to wait? So let us walk the life of one broken trade. A seller agrees to deliver shares. Settlement day comes. For any number of reasons, the shares are not there. Maybe the seller could not locate stock to borrow. Maybe a transfer gets stuck. Maybe it was a genuine operational error. Whatever the cause, the delivery owed into continuous net settlement does not arrive. That is the fail to deliver. Now, crucially, the buyer on the other end usually never notices because the central counterparty has already handed them their position. So the fail lies on the plumbing's books, not the buyer's. And regulators watch these fails closely because a small, quickly fixed fail is just friction. But a large, persistent one can mean something is genuinely wrong with the supply of a stock. That is exactly why there are hard rules about closing them out and a public data set that tracks them twice a month. Here is the machine that fixes a fail, one gear at a time. It is called Regulation SHO Rule 204, and it works like a stopwatch. Year 1. An ordinary short sale fail must be closed out by the beginning of regular trading hours on the settlement day right after the fail. That is the tight deadline. Year 2. If the fail came from a long sale or from bona fide market making, the rule gives more room until the beginning of trading on the third consecutive settlement day. Year 3. If someone is deemed to own the stock but cannot deliver yet, say restricted shares still clearing, the clock stretches to the third or fifth consecutive calendar day after the trade. Close out means the failing firm must buy or borrow the same quantity to deliver. Now the second machine, the transparency one. A stock lands on Regulation SHO's threshold securities list when fails are both large and stubborn, specifically when they reach at least 10,000 shares and at least 0.5% of the shares outstanding for 5 consecutive settlement days. Being on that list flips on extra pressure to clean the fails up, and the SEC publishes the raw fails data twice a month, pulled straight from the clearinghouse, so anyone can see which stocks are failing and by how much. This is the difference between a market that lets fails linger and one that forces them shut on a clock. This is not academic. Rewind to 2008. As the financial crisis raged, settlement fails exploded. In the Treasury market, delivery fails peaked at almost $16 trillion in October of that year, according to New York Fed data. In stocks, regulators panicked about persistent fails in financial names, and in September the SEC issued an emergency order temporarily banning short sales in the shares of roughly 799 financial companies. Then came the fix. When the SEC hardened the closeout rule into Rule 204 in 2009, its own economists measured the result. Average daily fails in equities fell by about 54%. The number of stocks stuck on the threshold list dropped by around 83% from its 2008 high. In other words, a tighter clock did not just look tidier, it measurably shrank how many broken promises were sitting unfixed in the system. The people this protects are ordinary buyers who are quietly assuming the share they paid for actually exists and will arrive. So here is the lens to carry away. Not every fail is sinister. Most are ordinary friction, a delivery that slipped and gets closed out on the clock a day or two later. A naked short is a different thing, selling short without having borrowed or arranged to borrow the stock at all. So delivery was never really lined up, and the two blur together in the data, which is why the threshold securities list matters. It flags the stocks where fails stopped being a blip and became a pattern. This does not tell you what a price does next. It tells you something subtler, that behind every clean-looking trade is a settlement system quietly deciding whether delivery is the rule or the exception. Next time you see a stock on that threshold list, you will know it is not a verdict, it is a question mark over the plumbing. If you want more of the machinery underneath the market, this is the channel for it.